Hello, today in our video I want to discuss the use of the radial gradient filter. So this is probably one of my most favorite tools in Lightroom, and that's because it's very flexible, it's easy to use, and it's an excellent tool in directing and sculpting light in your photograph. And that's what we try to do to bring out dimension and contrast and make our photographs look more realistic. And then after I show the basic use of this filter, I'm going to take this photograph here and apply about 5 or 6 radial gradient filters, no other type of filters. We're just going to use radial gradient. I'm going to show you what a difference it can make in your photograph with just simple radiant filter placement. All right, to start out with, let's just cover the very basics of a radial filter. We're going to click on our masking icon here, and we're going to choose radial gradient. And we're going to get a little plus icon, and I'm going to drag across the photograph just like this. You can place the radial gradient filter in the location you want by grabbing the center dot and dragging it over. Now you also have the ability to resize it once you get it in place, and you resize it by grabbing the sizing dots on either of the 4 sides and pulling up or pulling down and resizing. You can also rotate it by putting it in a specific place by grabbing the little icon here and rotating it to the position that you want it to be in. You can also rotate by hovering on the edges of each of one of the sizing dots, holding the mouse button down. You can also rotate it this way. So really you can rotate it at any corner, but this dot here is specifically for resizing or rotating. Now if you have a certain side that you want to bring in, because look, if we grab here and bring it, it moves all the sides, or the left and right side. If we grab this one, it drives the upper and lower. But if we hold our Alt and Option key down, Alt or Option on Mac, you can then adjust just one side. So it lets you be more specific. Once you get the side or the size and shape that you want, if you want to drag in proportion, hold your Shift key down, and you then can drag, and it'll hold proportion to the shape that you've made. All right, so we'll drag by proportion about right here, go in the center and move it exactly where we want it, and then we're good to go. The next thing we need to work on is our gradient. So in the center here, we're getting 100% of the effect of this gradient. So if I change my exposure, you can see the center gets the brightest part, and then the edges, it gradually diminishes. And that's what makes this tool so powerful, is this gradient. So when we look at the center, we're getting 100% of the effect. And when we move from the inner circle to the outer circle, we're going from 100 to 0 effect, which gives us a good light fall off. So if we were using this to use like direct to sunbeam, we know that the further the light travels, the less it hits an object. All right, so if we have a gradient that starts with the sun hitting here and the sun's coming in from the left to the right, then we know the further it gets away from the main sun source, the light drops off, and it creates more shadows and less light. And that's what makes this tool so powerful. Now let's put this back to the right size. We can adjust our gradient by clicking on this little red dot here and pulling back, which gives us really no gradient. In fact, if we look at our changes now, you can see that's a very stark edge, not very realistic. Right? So if we go to our feather and grab it and bring it in, so this would look more realistic. We have the main source of light here with a fall off from 100 to 0. And if we bring up the exposure now, see how more realistic that looks. If you make the gradient very soft, and when we say soft, we're usually at 75% to 100. So you can see that the center point really is very small. So you only get 100% right dead center, and then you get 100 to 0 across the whole gradient. So if we look at this change, see, we get more area of the bush lit up, but the light fall off looks very realistic. Right? So we don't have, something like this. Once you get your radial filter in place and your gradient the way you want it, you then can make your changes using your exposure slide, any slider here, contrast, we'll bring our highlights down, bring shadows up. We might increase the saturation. And we have one other slider that we can use, and that's the amount slider. You always have, these sliders to make changes in values, but like if we move the exposure slider, all we're doing is affecting the exposure. And remember, we made all these changes down here to get this picture exactly, or this area exactly like we wanted. But when we grab the amount slider, we move all those slider changes in proportion. Now you won't see them change. They're going to stay the same values that we have here, but it is decreasing all those, or the density of them, in proportion to the amount slider. So you increase it and decrease it, and all those changes you make will be moved at the same time. Alright, so that is our radial gradient. Now I'm going to reset this, and we're going to just do some basic changes to this and see what you think. The first thing I do, I look at my photograph and decide what's happening here. So this is at the Pemaquid Point in Maine, and it's a sunrise, and we have our sun over here that really hasn't even come up yet. It's a little bit before sunrise, but the sun will come up in this area here. So we're going to have light stream across right here. So let's kind of simulate that right now with a radial gradient filter. To make this filter work best, we're going to reduce the size of our photograph, because that's the power of the radial gradient. We don't have to have the whole filter on the photograph. We could just use a portion of it. So let's grab our radial gradient, and we're going to make a big one. About like this. I want to make the feather very, very small. I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to move this off to the side. Because remember, we have that feature of light fall off. So it's going to be brighter here, and then the light's going to fall off as it reaches these other points here. And we know the light's coming in right here because we can see it. We can see where it's hitting here. It's hitting the tops of these bushes. We just want to give it a little extra help, and we'll keep this half of the filter off and put the rest on our photograph, and let's see what happens here. And it's got to be very subtle. All right. So we're going to bring it just a little tiny bit. I don't know that we might give it a little bump in our temperature. Look at the highlights maybe a little bit. Bring up the shadows so we can see more of the light hitting here. I don't think our whites, maybe a little bit. Just a little bit. Okay, so here's our filter. Really only half of it is in here, but we want to bring in this light. We want it to bring it across here, so we have a good idea of what our light's doing when it's coming in from outside our frame. So if we turn this off now, we do a before and after, before and after. See, it's very subtle, but it is giving us an idea that this is where the sun is, and that's what it's doing. We're just giving our picture just a little help with that. All right, the next thing I want to do is that we have this area right here where the waves are hitting the rocks, and there was a little bit of fog here, and then creating a mist, and we have this light coming in which diffuses the light. The light gets diffused when it hits this mist or the water that's being misted up here. So let's grab another radial filter, create new radial filter, and we're going to put one right here because this is where the water is being kind of blown up a little bit. And we're going to grab our dehaze, and we're going to bring that down just a little bit. And you can see right in this area it's getting a little foggy. Let's see if we add a little contrast to it, if it helps a little bit. Not really. And we'll maybe add a little temperature to it to warm it up, because remember, we did have our sun coming in this way. And again, we're just going for very subtle changes. We don't want to go crazy by something like this. That's not real. So this was with no change, and this is with just a little change here. And then you can just decide how far you want this effect to take place. Do you want it smaller? Maybe rotate it a little bit. If we hover over it, we can see our overlay. So we're getting hit hard right here in the center, and then our fade off is right here. So let's look at our before and after. Let's turn the masking off. That looks pretty good to me. I'll go with that. Next, we want to put another radial filter on. We'll grab the radial filter, and I want to put one right here because the sun is hitting this rock. The sun's coming in, and it's lighting up this rock a little bit. So let's boost up the light a little bit on the rock, warm it up a little bit, right there. We also, we're thinking about our light. We have some light coming in here and brushing at the top of these plants. You can see how it's making it glow a little bit. So I'm going to make it a little warmer. I'm going to give it a little light. And as you put it in, you can see at that light, I'll make it brighter than normal. And I'll bring in my feather to see if that helps me a little bit. I just want to hit that specific area. And then once I see the area, I then can bring down my exposure to where I think it looks more natural. Alright. I want to put a radial mask that we were looking at earlier. I want one right up here, because it is kind of brushing the tops of these here. So let's bring this up just a little bit. Let's warm it up a little bit. Maybe a little contrast. Give it a little white to brighten it. Again, we're just trying to be subtle. We don't need to be crazy with it. Now, if we do want some brightness like this, and we see that we're getting some, let's turn on our overlay, we see we're getting some effect in this area, what you can do is go to this mask and hit subtract, and go to brush, and we'll move our flow up high. Make the size of our brush a little bigger. What we're going to do is just paint in this area to take away the purple, which is the effect of the mask. And by taking that away, we'll take away some of that glow that was showing up that we didn't need to have on that part of the photograph. So let's look at it now. Bring up the exposure and see we don't have any glow it was kind of overriding and showing up in this area. So now that doesn't show up anymore. So now we have a more directed light like this. Alright, let's grab one more radial gradient, and we're going to hit this area here. Again, I can see by the picture that it's being hit by light. If it's being hit, then let's juice it up a little bit and see what we can get. There's a little light there, make it a little warmer. I'm going to try one other area. There's a radial gradient. And this one's going to be very narrow. Rotate the direction. And it's just right in this area right here. And I'm going to bring up the exposure just a little bit. Warm it up a little bit. Because it is kind of hitting this here. Alright, so we have played 6 masks in our light and then different areas. As we hover over them, you'll see the areas that we've changed. Let's now turn off our mask and let's go before, after, before, after. So you can see we have made some good changes to the picture. Here it is here, it's kind of flat. I mean, the exposure is pretty good, but there's a lot of light coming into this picture that the camera really couldn't really bring in. So by using our radial gradients, we now have the light coming in here, it's hitting the plants, lighting up the rocks, and we could actually add more, you know, if we put another radial gradient right in this area. This one would be a real mild one because it's barely touching these. About like that. Maybe give it a little more saturation, see those little pink flowers. You could even put a radial gradient if you wanted to right up here to bring in more color. If we brought our saturation in right here, maybe add a little whites. Get a little more of the sunrise coming in there. And now let's do a before and after. Before, after, before, after. So as you can see, just by placement of these minor little radial gradients, we can make a big change in the way the photographs look. So what we did, we placed one for the sunbeam coming in, and then we put a little dehaze on the water where it was misting and diffused light going through the haze or the water. Then we lit up the rocks where the sun was hitting another part of the vegetation, more of the vegetation, a little more rock, a little slight change in the rocks on the leading edge of the cliff there, more changes there, and then a little change in color and brightness in the horizon to make our horizon just look a little prettier. Let's see, let's add some magenta to it, give it a little more character. All right, so that was our before and our after, before and after, just using basic radial gradients. If you guys have any questions or you want to work on a picture together, be sure to drop me an email and I'll be glad to help out. Thanks.